live. So we'll go ahead and get started. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and thank you for joining us for this special Naval War College Foundation Newport Lecture Series presentation, China and the Great Power Competition, Securing Your Business and Our Nation, with Dr. Anthony Vinci, Vice Chairman, Business Executives for National Security, Mr. Dan Holland, Vice Chairman and Treasurer, Naval War College Foundation, and Dr. Dex Wilson, Professor of Strategy and Policy at the U.S. Naval War College. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and sponsors, as well as my staff for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our generous foundation members, including many of you, the Naval War College has continued its innovative, cutting-edge education and research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education. Thank you. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College, our only client, and its mission to deliver excellence in education and research, and remains committed to providing the critical resources needed to advance its priorities of research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowments and endowed chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional studies. This evening, we are honored to partner with members of the Ben's Competitiveness Council, including Naval War College Foundation Vice Chairman Dan Holland, to deliver a compelling presentation for organizations and business leaders to consider regarding the pros and cons of conducting business with China. For added context, we invited Strategy and Policy Professor and the John A. Van Buren Chair of Asia Pacific Studies at the U.S. Naval War College to join us with this discussion and these esteemed business professionals. As a matter of protocol, should you have a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speakers during the Q&A session. We plan to address as many of your questions as time allows. Since the spring of 2020, we've been bringing Newport Lecture Series presentations and many other events hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. An added benefit of operating in this virtual environment, which has become rather routine courtesy of COVID-19, is the opportunity it presents to engage and interact with members from across the nation and around the world. We plan to continue these speaker series lectures virtually for the foreseeable future, short of a special in-person book signing presentation later this year in December. Now to introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speakers for tonight's presentation. Dr. Anthony Vinci is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security and is managing director at a private equity fund where he focuses on technology and supply chain investments. He serves as the Chief Technology Officer and Associate Director for Capabilities at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. As CTO, he drove the agency's efforts to bring artificial intelligence into the enterprise and to form public-private partnerships with Silicon Valley and other commercial technology centers. As an associate director, he was a member of the agency's executive committee and was responsible for overseeing National Geospatial Intelligence Agency offices of technology, research and development, contracting, financial management, program development, and strategy. Dr. Vinci was the founder and former CEO of Finder, a revolutionary technology company that crowdsources data from around the world, as well as Leviathan Analytics, an AI and geospatial data analytics company focused on global risk. Previously, he was on the management team at Bridgewater Associates. Dr. Vinci is a board member or advisor to several emerging technology and national security companies. He received his PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics and studied philosophy at Reed College and the University of Oxford. Dr. Vinci is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Business Executives for National Security, and a fellow of the Explorers Club. Mr. Daniel E. Holland III is Managing Director of Goldman Sachs and has been with the firm for 35 years. Since 2010, he has served as region head for the firm's private wealth management business in New England. From 2001 to 2010, he worked with the firm's hedge fund clients in prime brokerage. From 1999 to 2000, he was Chief Operating Officer of Fixed Income Currencies and Commodities Sales in North America and became resident manager of the Boston office and head of FICC in Boston in 1997. Vice Chairman Holland joined Goldman Sachs in 1987 as a fixed income sales generalist and was named managing director in 1999. Dan served in the United States Navy as a lieutenant surface warfare officer from 1991 and 1985, and in the U.S. Naval Reserve as an intelligence officer from 1986 to 1990. Dan is the vice chairman and treasurer of the Naval War College Foundation as a member of BENS. Mr. Holland serves as chairman of the advisory board of the Boston College Carroll School of Management and is an overseer of the USS Constitution Museum in Boston. Dan earned an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in economics from Boston College. Professor Andrew Dex Wilson is a professor in the Strategy and Policy Department and the John A. Van Buren Chair of Asia Pacific Studies at the Naval War College. He has lectured at military colleges and civilian universities across the United States and around the world. The author of a number of books and articles on Chinese military history, Chinese sea power, and Sun Tzu's The Art of War. He is presently at work on The Acme of Skill, Strategic Theory from Antiquity to the Information Age. Professor Wilson is also featured on the Great Courses with lecture series including The Art of War, Masters of War, History's Greatest Strategic Thinkers, and Understanding Imperial China, Dynasties, Life, and Culture. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Anthony Vinci, Mr. Dan Holland, and Professor Dex Wilson.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for inviting me. And in particular, thank you for inviting BENS, Business Executives with National Security. BENS is a group of business executives, CEOs, CTOs, lawyers, managers of businesses, some of which have been in or focused on military issues, but almost all, the majority of which are focused on businesses that have nothing to do with traditional national security. But all the members of BENS volunteer their time and their expertise to help address pressing national security challenges. It's a purely volunteer organization for most of us as members. And one of the things that we've been thinking about as members and as BENS recently, like I suspect many of you have been, are new challenges to national security, and in particular, the great power competition between the United States and China. And towards that, we put together a group which we call the Competitiveness Council, of which I'm the vice chair, to begin to work on that subject. And one of our first products out of that was a primer on Chinese competition with America, particularly in economic and technological areas. And this is sort of the culmination of our insights from the business world on the national security challenges posed by China. It's meant really to educate us as business leaders across the country, not just the BENS members, but as many people as we can, who are doing business right now and may, whether they like it or not, be part of the strategic competition with China. And so towards that, we've put together some of these remarks, which we'll talk through today. So the United States is at a watershed moment in its geostrategic rivalry with China. Well, while we were all once optimistic that China's embrace of capitalist principles at the turn of the century would lead to opportunities for trade and mutual prosperity, we now know that we have transitioned to a period of outright global competition for both geopolitical leadership and influence at economic, political, diplomatic, technological, and military levels. And while Russia rightly dominates headlines today with their aggression towards Ukraine, raising red flags for most of us in the global community, China, with its advancing military might and sheer economic power, poses the more enduring challenge to US prosperity and security. And recent policy decisions and aspirations stated by Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, which we'll cover in this presentation, have made it clear we cannot continue with business as usual. Corporate leaders need to make strategic shifts to their operations to protect their businesses and to shore up investments. And by doing so, they will help safeguard the nation as well as their businesses in this period of great power competition. Indeed, it's business leaders, along with programmers, engineers, entrepreneurs, and others, who are at the front edge of this competition. And it will be business leaders who will help determine if the nation continues to outpace a surging China and prevent them from unfairly shaping the international economic system and spreading their authoritarian policies around the world. Today's presentation will go over the many ways in which the Chinese geopolitical and business practices harm US businesses, discuss some of China's strategies and policies to specifically outpace the US, and briefly go through opportunities where the two nations can cooperate. Finally, we'll go over 8 measures that will help business leaders limit their exposure to China, protecting their businesses and protecting our nation. First, operating and investing in China is risky. And put simply, it's bad business in our view. Business IP, autonomy, and even ability to repatriate profits are all at risk. Businesses in China, like everything in Chinese society, are tightly controlled by their government. The Communist Party requires and places political officials into senior management positions and on corporate boards. They also use their influence to distort private enterprise by denying credit to private companies who do not adhere to state planning. And they punish executives who do not tailor their businesses to achieve state goals, as we saw with, for example, Jack Ma, who founded Alibaba. The blurred lines between private enterprise and the CCP's policy goals should concern any private business operating in China, as the government may, in essence, come to control a foreign subsidiary at any time. In other words, while you may think your company is competing with another company, it's really competing with a nation state. Or quite literally Chinese Communist Party officials directing companies to put your company out of business, take over your Chinese subsidiary, or worse. Good example is ARM China, the Chinese subsidiary of UK-based chipmaker ARM. UK ARM raised the alarm in September 2021 after China's ARM CEO, Alan Wu, declared that the company would begin making decisions independent of its parent company and essentially split off from ARM, taking IP with it. ARM China's decision came conspicuously at a time when the Chinese government sought to sever foreign links to domestic chip manufacturers so that it could gain its own semiconductor supply chain independence. CCP control also creates significant downside risk on American investments, as was seen in the crash of the Chinese tech industry this past year and the destabilization resulting from Evergrande. Moreover, operating in China means your data belongs to the government. Pursuant to China's 2014 counter-espionage law and its 2017 national intelligence law, companies are required to support, assist, and cooperate with the state's intelligence network, effectively making companies unable to protect any data and information from government demands and making your business an indirect intelligence collector for the CCP. The law includes employee rosters and customer lists, so effectively it grants the CCP access to the personal data the company holds on anyone worldwide that touches Chinese systems. And while other countries employ similar laws to prevent espionage or protect citizens from attacks, China overreaches to extract information from all businesses operating within its borders. Take Apple, for example. It adheres to Chinese government mandates to store customer data on Chinese servers within the country, thus allowing personal data to be stored on state-owned servers operated by Chinese state employees. Apple's compromises have made it nearly impossible for the company to stop the Chinese government from gaining access to emails, photos, documents, contacts, and locations of millions of Chinese residents, to include those like the Uyghurs who are oppressed by the CCP. The Chinese control over US company data potentially opens US companies to significant legal and public relations risk. Consider how your customers would feel if they know that your company allowed its product to be used to round up ethnic minorities and to transport them to concentration camps. Speaking of sensitive company information, stopping the transfer of intellectual property remains one of the foremost challenges for both US businesses and security. And Chinese state actors have become expert at acquiring IP, both through illegal and through quasi-legal means. Companies who are engineering everything from proprietary rice and corn seeds to wind turbine software and high-end medical devices have been victims, with estimated costs to the US economy ranging from $225 billion to $600 billion annually. Moreover, according to the FBI, China is not just focusing on innovation and R&D. They're also obtaining a multitude of data that could give them a competitive advantage, to include cost and pricing information, internal strategy documents, and personally identifiable information. Situation is bad enough when trying to protect that IP within the US. When that IP lies inside China, there's no chance. You can assume that information is compromised from day one. Succinctly, your company's own IP, what you and your team created and developed, may be copied to compete against you. Finally, ESG. Environmental, social, and governance factors have increasingly become more important for investors as we become more conscious of the impact industry has on the world. And we're seeing the power of ESG factors playing out today, as nearly every multinational corporation has since pulled out of Russia as a rebuke to Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Now, we're not equating the situation in Europe with what's happening in China, but regarding ESG as it pertains to East Asian nation, US businesses and investors should be aware that attention to the CCP's treatment of the Uyghurs is likely to increase in years ahead. And scrutiny of China's environmental track record is likely to become more intense. This leaves any US company doing business with China with significant reputational risk. Consumers could mount boycotts of products produced in connection to any of these ESG factors. For example, H&M, Nike, Adidas, and Burberry recently came under public pressure to stop sourcing their materials from Xinjiang thanks to a public boycott. CCP human rights violations are morally wrong, but they're also bad for business. Now we know about the risks of doing business in China. Let's talk a little bit more about China's stated policies and strategies that they're using to outpace the US. Primarily, let's look at Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, and civil military fusion. Made in China 2025 is China's industrial policy aimed at making the nation the dominant global power in high-tech manufacturing. Along with establishing industrial benchmarks, it provides government investment and resources to mobilize state-controlled enterprises in 10 high-value industries: information technology, robotics, aerospace, ocean engineering, high-speed rail, green technology, power equipment, new materials, medicine and medical devices, and agricultural equipment. The government's picking winners and subsidizing businesses are nothing new, but American businesses may find it difficult to compete with China's sheer scale of support. Competition from Chinese businesses benefiting from this support could degrade the position of US companies in export markets where the Chinese have a placed marker. More alarmingly, the CCP can use its de facto control of private enterprise to build in spying or censorship capabilities, which create further risks for IP theft and unfair competition, not to mention the prospects of global totalitarian system control. While the success of China 2025 has been mixed, Chinese firms have mastered production in key sectors, to include renewable energy and electric vehicles. Most notably, China is at the forefront of 5G deployment, boosted by the Chinese-backed firm Huawei and its strength in mobile networking equipment. Huawei had access to as much as $75 billion in state support to help it grow from a little-known phone switch vendor to the world's largest telecom equipment company. These are the businesses of the future, and they're being heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. it will be extremely hard for US companies playing by the rules to compete. China's second strategy to outcompete the US globally is the development of the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. BRI, which offers $1.3 trillion in infrastructure funding and economic incentives throughout Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, is designed to build a unified market of international trade, economic reliance, and cultural exchange throughout the world. But ultimately, it's used to preserve the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party rule, silencing any nation who speaks ill of President Xi or the CCP. Right now, the program has expanded to more than 65 countries, which comprise 1/3 of all world trade and GDP and almost 2/3 of the world's population. And it's steering China to become the leading trade and economic hub in the world. China is likely to feature much more heavily in these markets at the expense of US businesses. Systematic delays in transport, port usage, or other logistics systems within BRI countries will most certainly hamper availability of critical goods. Consider this. Right now, the global logistics system is largely neutral, if not beneficial to US companies. Global logistics system controlled by China would be more beneficial to Chinese businesses and likely undermine US companies like yours by making it more costly or slower than your Chinese competitors. Lastly, developed as a means to propel China to be the most technologically advanced military in the world, their civil-military fusion strategy combines defense and civilian businesses' capability to advance state, military, and geopolitical goals. This includes government investment in private industries, talent recruitment programs, forced technological transfer, intelligence gathering, and outright theft. The CCP specifically seeks to exploit the inherent dual-use technologies, such as quantum computers. Basically, any advanced technology business operating in China could find themselves unwittingly aiding the development of weapons and capabilities which could put the US and our military service members in harm's way. The US has been the sole superpower for decades. This has ensured our way of life. It's increasingly imaginable that we lose that status and return to a world in which our way of life is threatened. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dan Holland, for comments from him. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinci. Now, we're not advocating that America should completely cut ties with China and turn to another Cold War. China remains a necessary trading partner and major player on the world stage, politically and economically. We are not so far gone that we need to split the world in two again. However, we do need to moderate our relationship. Some people talk about decoupling, in which America should stem or cut trading ties with China. We believe in that decoupling for supply chain necessities. Recall back to the beginning of COVID, when we did not have enough PPE to protect our doctors and nurses. Or imagine a future scenario where we are unable to support our service members during a war if China did not agree with our actions. We need to be realistic and protect our nation's supply chain. Our view is that strategic competition requires resiliency and that America should begin to onshore or diversify the supply chain of certain key products and industries. American businesses can help to do this by considering ways to create this diversification of the supply chain. It is good for America as it ensures that we retain geopolitical optionality. But it's also good for business in that it ensures that your own supply chain will not be compromised by the aggressive geopolitical actions of China. Moreover, China and the US should continue to actively work together on climate change. Because of China's size and influence, they are essential to mitigating the worst effects of climate change could have on the world. Climate change is the foremost persistent global challenge of our time. And as the two largest contributors of carbon pollution in the world, it is incumbent on both the United States and China to lead international efforts to implement solutions that will stem the devastating impacts of extreme weather events. American businesses can take advantage of their importance in China's economic model to negotiate better environmental regulations from the Chinese government at the national and local level and ensure their enforcement. So, okay, we've outlined the risks, China's strategies, and opportunities for cooperation. So what should business leaders do with this knowledge? How can they protect their businesses in the age of great power competition with China? We offer 8 initial steps. Number 1, realize the risks of operating or investing in China. Your company intellectual property, brands, and autonomy are all at risk if you expand into the Chinese market. Number 2, build greater resiliency into your production and supply chain. From the pandemic to Russia today, we have experienced the impact of being overly reliant on global supply chains for essential goods. Diversifying manufacturing bases back to the United States or friendly nations, right-shoring production of critical components for advanced technology, such as semiconductors, and having a complete enterprise visibility of the value chain will make U.S. businesses more resilient to disruption and fortify the nation's economic position. Third, secure and employ capital from trusted sources. China continues to offer U.S. firms billions in capital, but senior executives and corporate leaders looking to grow their businesses should examine financing options closely. As we learned, investment connected to China could place your intellectual property and control of your company at risk. Fourthly, consider the U.S. government a potential customer for dual-use technologies. Private enterprise is developing and mastering a number of technologies that would enhance the federal government's ability to protect and serve the American people, to include artificial intelligence and game engine technology. Business leaders should work with federal agencies, particularly those at the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security, to explore how their products could aid government efforts and counter advances made by China's military-civil fusion strategy. Number 5, prioritize trade with allies and investment in emerging markets outside of China. Although China will eventually become the world's largest economy, it will still only be about 15% of global GDP, leaving significant opportunity for growth in other markets. Trade and investment with friendly nations, to include many countries targeted by China's Belt and Road Initiative, creates economic efficiency and integration that would be a hedge against Chinese expansion and influence. Number 6, get ahead of ESG issues. Partnerships with Chinese companies harbor significant ESG risks that could soon be at the forefront of consumers' minds. Businesses should price these ESG risks into their Chinese operations and determine whether the cost of doing business in China remains profitable. Number 7, investors in particular should assess Chinese investments on their balance sheets and retirement plans they may manage. Investment into China is directed by the CCP into political priorities rather than being governed by the market, and therefore funneled to further Chinese geopolitical aims. The politically driven nature of the investments means their returns are not what they may appear and are in fact becoming increasingly precarious positions to hold. And lastly, American business leaders should speak collectively. You are best positioned to inform your industry peers about the risks of the Chinese business environment and speak out about the authoritarian practices of the Chinese Communist Party. Also, when we speak together, we are a powerful voice who can educate policymakers on the necessary incentives and steps needed to outpace China. Conflict between great powers in the 21st century will be very different than the wars fought in the 19th and 20th centuries. As noted China expert Brigadier General Robert Spalding recognized, instead of bombs and bullets, conflict in the 21st century is largely about ones and zeros and dollars and cents. Economics, finance, data information, manufacturing, infrastructure, and communications. Control those fronts and you can prevail in a conflict without firing a shot. That's what we aim to do, arm our business leaders with the information they need to make the right decisions and employ the sound strategies that will protect their businesses and ensure America remains prosperous and safe. We hope U.S. business leaders and companies globally will take steps today to limit their exposure from undue Chinese influence. As, again, outpacing China in the coming decades will be as reliant on you, our programmers, engineers, entrepreneurs, and citizens, as much as sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines, and guardians. There's a saying, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You may not be interested in great power competition, but it is interested in you. Thank you, and now I will turn it over to Professor Andrew Wilson for some additional comments on China and great power competition. Over to you, Dex.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the foundation for inviting me and for being the very generous sponsors of the chair that I'm very honored to hold, the Van Buren Chair. So, in an era of great power competition, I think it's important to appreciate that if I had one word to describe China, it would be competitive. And this is not just in terms of its competition with the outside world, with the United States in particular, but just the intensity of competition within China in terms of politics, in the economy, even and perhaps especially in the Belt and Road Initiative, and in society. Now, many have this perception, and it's not completely wrong, that the party, and perhaps even Xi Jinping himself, have tremendous influence. They might direct everything. Well, that's not wholly accurate. It's true that this is an authoritarian system, and the party and the General Secretary Xi Jinping hold many reins. But I think it's also important to understand why China is so competitive internally, to realize that what the party does not control, and in many ways, what the party does not want to control. For example, while COVID seemed like a paradigm of the Chinese response to COVID, seemed like a paradigm of party control and an obedient population, if anything, COVID revealed, as it did here in the United States, just how much of our lives is lived online in a largely ungoverned space, and how much information about our lives exists online. Equally shocking for the Chinese and for many in the United States in recent years is how much private companies know about the lives of the Chinese people and know about their lives, their work, their movements of this population. Case in point, very famously last summer, the party and the economic authorities in Beijing stepped in and reined in Didi, which is the Chinese equivalent of Uber. That was in part worries about exposure of this major corporation on global markets. But equally, it's that this IPO potentially opened a massive cache of consumer data, including the movements, the habits, the predilections of government, party, and military personnel. Personnel who, because of the ferocious competition for upward mobility in China, are particularly vulnerable to exploitation by foreign intelligence that's more than happy to fund the bribes that are so crucial to promotions in China. And while this is a truly authoritarian regime and it's utterly loathsome, and definitely not democratic by any stretch of the imagination, regardless what the propaganda says, it is nonetheless very interested in and very often very responsive to public opinion. It is competing for the hearts and minds of its own people. This summer's crackdown on the online education market in particular, a shock to the system that convinced many in global investments and American investing community that China was literally uninvestable because the way in which the party basically demolished an entire industry in the course of a few weeks. This is the after-school cram schools. And part of it was a deep concern about foreign corporations and foreign teachers influencing China's youth. At the same time, and I would say it was even more a response to popular revulsion to the cruel, manipulative, utterly awful business model around which these online tutoring programs were built. A model that preyed on the insecurities of China's parents and brutalized China's children. So those are just a couple of examples of how China is not quite the Orwellian dystopian state it is. It's perceived as. I would say all of the assumptions about that are absolutely accurate, however, when it comes to places like Xinjiang and Tibet. But I think it's important if you're going to invest in China or you're interested in understanding China at all, that you also appreciate the limits of the reach of the state, not merely just in terms of capabilities, in terms of governance, but also the hesitation of the state when it comes to the extent to which it feels it wants to literally control on a day-to-day basis the behavior and the movements, the thoughts of its people, or the extent to which it wishes to fundamentally control the actions and innovations of corporations, much less those of other countries. It certainly has aspirations for greater control over all these sectors, building government capacity, increasing its leverage in foreign policy. But what China is not doing is equally as interesting and important to people who are interested in doing business with China, or in a world in which China's influence grows every single day, to understand the limitations as well as the capabilities of the regime, the party, the economy, and the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Dex, and thank you, gentlemen, for your clear and concise and direct presentation and thoughtful remarks. They certainly do identify some action items for organizations and business leaders to consider, obviously regarding a near-peer competitor such as China. Ladies and gentlemen, I now would like to open the floor for questions. As mentioned previously, please submit questions via the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many questions as time permits. The first question, I see we've got 3 in the queue, really, from Rick Bagshaw. Is there definitive information regarding Chinese aid for Russia's invasion into Ukraine? If it becomes apparent that this is taking place, what could or should NATO and/or the U.S. do about it? Not sure that you might be able to address that, but perhaps you have some ideas on how that might influence the business and industry.
I don't know. I don't know that we would be good to answer the question about definitive information regarding Chinese aid. But one interesting question to ask is how U.S. businesses would handle Chinese aid when it comes to Russia. So American businesses have been surprisingly good. And I say surprisingly on purpose because I wasn't sure that it would be the case in blocking off Russia. I think a lot of people saw very quickly how bad it was in Ukraine. And companies very willingly pulled out, even before there were any sort of customer boycotts or anything like that, that would have been pressure. Now, would it be so easy for them to do so, for companies to pull out if it was China? Russia's a pretty small market. China's a really big market. It's not clear. It's honestly not clear to me whether US companies would. I suspect it would have to be really bad for U.S. companies to pull out of China altogether. I would say, we would be talking, we would have to be talking kind of Nazi Germany level, travesty for American companies to truly pull out of such a big market. However, in limited cases, if there were certain companies supporting Russia, could American companies kind of make some, make it harder for some of those companies? Possibly. And might they pull out of certain areas? It's possible. I would like to see it, but I think it's going to be a big test for our nation's economy and for American businesses to see how they'll treat China in a similar circumstances to what we've seen in Russia.
I think that's really well said. I think that, and I'm not in a position to talk about any definitive information either, just, what all of us see in the press. And I think there's talk about, is China trying to buy some natural resources on the cheap from Russia, given that other parts of their market have been shut down? Are they trying to buy oil? Are they trying to buy nickel? Are they trying to buy different wheat and different products? And I agree with you, Anthony. I mean, just the size and scale of the market is just vastly different from Russia. Russia has a GDP about the size of Italy. China is vastly bigger than that. I too was impressed that there have been over 500 countries that have now pulled out of Russia. And it remains to be seen what that would look like in a broader, conflict with a great power competitor. I think that China is in a very difficult position. I think that communique that came out of Beijing before the Olympics with President Xi and President Putin aligning to displace the US as the world hegemon was a real clarion call and a wake-up call for the world. And I think China is just in a really challenging spot right now because the rest of the global market is really important to their economy. And they need to do business in Europe. They need to do business in the US. They need to do business elsewhere. And putting that all at risk to support to support Russia, I think would be a real problem for them. I think they're just taking a lot of notes and learning from the West's reaction to the events in Ukraine and taking that all into account for whatever they decide to do on the world stage later.
Thank you, Anthony. And Dan, Dex? Yeah.
I was just going to make one real quick addition to what Dan was saying, is that individual consumers do have a choice to be active in the matter. And I would hope that as individuals, we would make the right decisions about what products we purchase, which have a supply chain going back to China or Chinese good and so forth. So there is that as well. It's not just on businesses, it's on individual consumers as well.
Thank you, Anthony. Dex, do you have some?
Ukraine is obviously a terrible, terrible tragedy, and if not militarily complicit, certainly economically and morally complicit. China is certainly economically and morally complicit in it. But no matter how awful things get in Ukraine, they are unlikely to reach the scale and sinister extent of what's been going on in Xinjiang for the past 5 years in terms of the targeted efforts to essentially erase an entire culture, to create in the near future a permanent underclass, to drive population growth of the Muslims who live in the region down to something manageable, to indoctrinate the next generation, and then simply overwhelm the place. Few things could get any more evil than that, and still many companies invest in China, but in particular in industries that are directly linked to what the state and the party are doing in Xinjiang, in particular when it comes to the agricultural market, and in particular the cotton industry in Xinjiang. So if we can't do it for that, I don't know what revelations about Ukraine would change our behavior. That's significantly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. The next question is from Anthony Cowden. Janet Yellen said that the U.S. would impose sanctions on China if China attacked Taiwan. What would you think the effect would be on industry if the U.S. were to modify the Taiwan Relations Act today to spell out specific sanctions that would automatically be imposed, whatever else the U.S. might do should China attack Taiwan?
You know, there's a cynical part of me, unfortunately, which thinks that businesses would pretty quickly, especially finance, bake that in effectively, the possibility of sanctions, and they would kind of bake into the valuations of Chinese companies and so forth, what they would do. And then given the growth in the Chinese economy, that would still probably lead to continued investment by pension funds and so forth through ETFs into the Chinese economy. So probably wouldn't do much, maybe a notch or two loss in the valuation. In terms, on the other hand, it could be a strong signal of support for Taiwan that could be beneficial and kind of change some of the geopolitical decision making by Xi and the CCP. So that could be some benefit in that.
I think the Taiwan Relations Act is deliberately vague today, right? And it leaves a lot of unknowns. People can speculate on what the United States may or may not do, but I think spelling out specific sanctions and specific actions, I think it's better just leave them guessing. I think they're taking a lot of notes on what's happened over the last number of weeks in Europe and have a pretty good sense. And the real question is, I think the West was pretty united in what happened in Ukraine. The question is, how united is the world if something were to happen in Taiwan? And that's just a great unknown that I don't think any of us have a whole lot of insight into unless it were actually to happen. Let's hope it doesn't.
Thank you. Dex, anything additional to add?
I concur with all those assessments, but at the same time, I think the moral support is absolutely crucial, and I think that is probably getting the most, that and the military issues that Russia is confronting is getting the most attention, the most concern in Beijing. But at the same time, Xi in particular has made it clear that he's no longer invested in growth at any cost, and in many ways, some belt tightening in the midst of a crisis that seems to serve China's core national interests would be acceptable to him, at least, and probably to the rest of the leadership.
Yeah, agree. Thank you. From Anthony Cowden again, and you might have touched on some of this too. In the past, U.S. business industry has resisted holding China accountable for their business practices. Their large market is simply too tempting, and profits worth the cost of doing business. What is different today?
Well, one thing that's different is we're starting to see what the costs have really truly been for American businesses. For example, in IP theft. For a long time, that IP theft was kind of brushed under the carpet. Companies didn't want to bring it up or try to sue Huawei or other Chinese companies doing it. And now we see more and more it's being made public, and it's being made public by the government or companies themselves. And, I think that's a big part of the purpose of the Ben's Competitiveness Council and the talk that we just gave is to kind of let companies know and realize what these costs truly are so that they will make different decisions in terms of how they do work in China. Again, it's not to say we should completely decouple from China or anything like that. I don't think we're saying that, but that you have to realize the costs, and there are things that you can do to mitigate those costs and risk to your business.
I think the other difference today is we've learned through the pandemic and from the war in Ukraine, just the risk to supply chains. And we've all learned to understand that, a few years ago, everything was about globalization. It was about offshoring, and it was about efficiency and lowest cost of production, all those sorts of things. And I think that businesses are taking into account the risks of offshoring any part of their enterprise, whether it's supply chain or anything else. And I think that's a dramatic change from where we were, certainly 3 years ago, pre-pandemic, and even 2 months ago, pre-Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. From Diana Carlson-Sherbo, what will the aging of the Chinese population do to the country economically? Do they have plans to deal with this?
Yeah,
If I could, oh, sorry, please.
go Dex, please go.
Yeah, the aging of the population is something that is deeply, deeply concerning. I mentioned the issue with the afternoon cram schools and how that this is a business model that preys on the insecurities of Chinese families. And in addition to a whole range of implications of this aging population and the skew in the population and the implications of the one-child policy and the surfeit of young men versus young women, how that drives the real estate market, the craziness there, is the pressure that this puts on society in terms that because the Chinese market, the stock market in particular, the weaknesses of the state-owned enterprise sector, the weaknesses of the public health system, most people in China, their 401k is their child or their grandchild. And what this system is doing, or the way this is going, is that currently grandparents and parents can pour their resources usually into one child. But the challenge is in 20 years from now, that one child will then be responsible for as many as the upkeep of as many as 6 adults. So that has profound influences for the economy. And it creates a real challenge too, because while the party wants the economy to be skewed and the society to be skewed to making more stuff, more wide body aircraft, more semiconductors, to create stuff more productive and to make more babies, I think the society is still very much moving towards make more money as a way to deal with this incredible social implication of the demographic issues going on.
Maybe
Thanks, Dick.
that may be partially behind the Belt and Road Initiative, right? The Chinese government isn't big on immigration. They're not big on bringing others into their society, into their culture, into their country. And part of the outreach of the Belt and Road Initiative is to just expand, partially due to the demographic challenges that they face.
Thanks, Dan. Dex, appreciate that. From Navy War College Foundation Regional Director, Matt Santangelo. Matt, let's see on here. Many U.S. companies are fence sitting, not mentioning the words authoritarian and CCP or the word Taiwan, for example. How can we act together to message versus standing alone and risking it versus our competitor firms?
Yeah, to me, this is the most important and kind of scariest issue, is that I think the Chinese government is very specifically trying to create a norm in which it's not worth the risk for US companies or individuals to say bad things about China or Xi or various issues. And that's just straight up censorship, goes against, I think, everything we stand for in a liberal democracy. So to me, it's extremely scary. And they are, I think, purposely and strategically kind of preying upon individual companies, rather than industry, so they can pick them off when they're smaller rather than going up against bigger ones. We're starting to see some companies, organizations, people push back. Actors who don't star in action movies that sell well in China are more likely to, speak up versus those who have to sell a lot of movies in China. But at least, there's some people. And then, if you think about the women's tennis organization and what happened, they were willing to kind of stand up a little bit. So changing that norm, I think, is the case. And I think, again, part of what we're trying to do at Ben's and just remind people how important these things really are. And that when you're in the leadership of a company and you're making a decision on a PR issue, how to handle that, it has effects beyond just, the immediate kind of quarters, revenue numbers. It has effects upon you as an individual in the world we're going to live in. And I think that CEOs and executives are going to have to start thinking that way, and in a way that I think we did think this way during the Cold War, especially in the 50s and 60s, where American companies were very willing to kind of stand against communism. I think we're just going to have to kind of think that way as leaders of companies, and then make those decisions, even if they're hard, still make them, and that investors will have to think that way too, and accept that there may be some loss of revenue in some of their companies they're invested in for a long-term good cause, which is the kind of continued way of life in America and the kind of continued strength of these companies.
Anthony, thank you. Donald Harkle wrote, just to recognize him, of course, he asked a similar question as far as the declining age demographic. I'm just going to move quickly to Mark Wallenberg. We have about 3 minutes left. From Mark, what role does the dollar as a reserve currency play in the global economic competition play with China?
I'll take a stab at it. Listen, the dollar as a reserve currency is really one of the most important things of our national power and our national security as a country. It's the dollar as a reserve currency that enables us to apply sanctions when applicable around the world. And the danger, my personal opinion, is as we continue to use sanctions against various potential adversaries and adversaries around the world, they find ways to work around it. Economies don't completely shut down because they're sanctioned. And as we continue to use sanctions as an arm of diplomacy and an arm of power, it's a risk that these countries will find ways around it. And if they had a way to work around the dollar as a reserve currency, they certainly would. And there are efforts to try to do that. A number of countries are starting, their own digital currencies. Some people think that some digital currencies might someday replace the dollar, but as long as the United States has the most powerful military and the most powerful economy in the world, I'm pretty confident the dollar will remain the reserve currency. I think, you talk about bilateral transactions that take place between certain countries, and they try to use certain currencies for buying energy and other things. I think it's a medium to longer term risk. I don't think it's a near term risk, but I think it's critically important to our national security that we do everything that we can to maintain the dollar as a reserve currency around the world.
Excellent, gentlemen. Thank you again for your time. We'll break it off here. Still had a lot of questions in the queue, but maybe we can shoot them out via email if you're inclined and have the time to answer. That might be wonderful for our guests. It was truly an honor and privilege to host all of you this evening and to speak about a very interesting and relevant topic. And we appreciate you, again, taking time out of your busy schedules to spend it with us this evening. Well done.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's special presentation. Our next speaker series event will be on Wednesday, April 20th by Dr. Lindsay Kahn, Associate Professor in the National Security Affairs Department of the Naval War College, who will speak about military professionalism under political polarization. Updates to this presentation and others are posted on our webpage at nwcfoundation.org/our-events. Thank you for tuning in tonight and for your continued support for the missions of Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. The board and staff continue to work to generate the resources and margin of excellence required by the college to educate and inform today's decision makers and tomorrow's leaders. Your support and very generous tax-deductible contributions, no matter how small, are an investment in their learning and in our national security and position of leadership on the global stage. So thank you again. As always, we seek to expand our membership and raise awareness of the great institution which is the Naval War College. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're already a Naval War College Foundation member, perhaps and know others who might like to learn more about the Naval War College and Foundation, please consider a gift of membership to those who may share your interests and concerns for our national security. They make great graduation gifts and birthday presents. And if you need any additional information, you can just visit us on our webpage and look for a membership. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your evening and stay well.